let us begin here tonight and find out about a native son of Rochester, Lewis Swift, who we can call our own comet hunter. Now, we might want to think, what is it that, how does passion begin? What sparks it? Let's think of yourself, perhaps, where maybe, how did you get interested in astronomy or some other area that you particularly like? Well, Lewis Swift got interested at a very early age. He was born in Clarkson, New York, on Leap Day in February 29th, 1820. So in his lifetime, he celebrated only about 20 birthdays, I would guess, according to that calculation on that. Anyway, in 1833, he had a farm accident, and primitive medical treatment had left him with a severe limp that prevented him from doing any kind of farm work. He then attended the Clarkson Academy. That was the first class of Clarkson Academy. And he turned out to be a very good student. It was kind of a liberal education that he got, but he had a particular interest in science. He was interested in comets and things because Lewis and the rest of the world were impressed by a gigantic meteor shower in 1833. Fantastic it must have been because of the drawings of what it looked like at that time. Now, that was 1833, and he was age 13 at that. At age 15, he also saw Halley's Comet as it came through. Now, that was only the second time that Halley's Comet, as it was predicted by Halley, came through, because Halley predicted it in 1682. Now, remember our friend Charles Messier in 1758, he was anticipating the reappearance of Halley's Comet, which he, of course, saw. So that was a full 100 years before that. Then there was also a comet in 1843. That comet was called the Great Comet. They called a number of them Great Comets back then, but that was the Great Comet of 1843. It came through at a magnitude -7, and it was visible 1 degree from the sun in daylight. Wow. It had a 40-degree tail. Now, about this comet, this is kind of interesting what he said. He was interviewed, and in this interview, where he was talking about his having seen that comet, he said that one night on his way to singing school, as he called it, on his way to singing school, he saw a comet. Now, the next day, he told his teacher about it, and his teacher kind of laughed at him. 3 days later, it was announced that Comet C 1843 was announced. Now, that's kind of interesting. Was he a young person at that time when he saw this? And evidently he saw it in the sky. Eventually, other people had also seen it too, though he was not the first. He's not claiming that. But the fact is, he saw that comet when he was 23 years old. Now, I don't know about whether he's got his dates mixed up or what the thing was. But anyway, he had seen a comet which other people hadn't seen at that early time. Well, now, as a young man, Swift had in his 20s traveled westward in the United States as well as Canada. And he was lecturing and demonstrating electricity and magnetism. Those were a couple scientific areas that he had had quite a bit of had quite a bit of interest in, and he at a young age went out on a lecture circuit and told the story. Now, one of the things that he did at that time, he was clever with making things and inventing things. He himself had invented a way of projecting the image from a microscope onto, I assume, some kind of a screen, and he used that in the lectures that he had given at that time. I don't have more details on what that might have looked like, but that was rather interesting. He was out there giving talks with and visualizing those talks with this device that he got. Well, at age 30, he married. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Wait a minute. I may have skipped a slide on that. Yes, I did. A very important slide. Let's go back there. Comets and things. Yeah. Let me see. Oh, I was supposed to tell you there when I got off a little bit. Here. I'll come down here and tell you the end of my notes at the bottom. He married at the age of 30, and he set up a hardware store in his wife's hometown. If you're not familiar with New York State, as I was not, the hardware store was actually in Hunt's Corners, which is down near Marathon, which is south of Cortland. It's all in Cortland County, and that would be important to Swift then for the rest of his life. Now, during that time, he ordered and then he read books by the Scottish Presbyterian Reverend Thomas Dick. Now, his name comes up a little bit later as well. Reverend Dick was writing and preaching about a kind of mixture of astronomy and theology. In particular, he believed that other planets, in fact, all of the other planets in our solar system, he thought that they were populated, I guess, with people or maybe other beings or something like that. But that was part of what he believed. Now, Dr. Dick had given detailed instructions on how to make yourself microscopes and telescopes. And so at age 36, Swift bought a second-hand 3-inch objective lens, which in today's money would have been $180 today, but it cost him $5. And he built his first telescope. Now, in his use of that, somehow that lens got dropped, or the telescope got dropped at some time, and he had to order another one. Now, he ordered the second piece of glass from Henry Fitz in New York City. Now, Fitz at that time was the #1 telescope maker in all of the United States. And that scope would become what he called his Comet Seeker. Now, later, after another accident, he would have to replace that 4.5-inch objective with an Alvin Clark piece of glass. And he also upgraded the telescope with an eyepiece that would allow him to see 3 degrees. That was made by a local jeweler that made that. Now, he had a kind of near miss, you might say. He saw a comet in 1853, and he thought that he had discovered a nice bright comet, but it turned out that other people had, and they had seen that. But he kind of saved the situation by writing a descriptive article in the Albany Astronomical Journal. Now, because of this, his name began to be spread around, certainly among people in New York State and home by, and he became known as the professor. Now, Rochester was an area that was beginning to get interested in science in the 1870s, 1880s. And at that time, Rochester had a number of visiting lecturers that would come through. That was pretty popular back then, obviously, because they didn't have telephone and telegraph and radio and television and so on. The lecturers actually came to town, and there were a number of courses that were offered around Rochester related to science and related to astronomy in particular. Now, it was said that Alvin Clark and Company sold more telescopes in Rochester than any other city. Then came along 1862. In 1862, you might notice here the illustration that we've got on the side here. That illustration is showing you the orbit of the Swift-Tuttle comet from 1850 to 2150 as it goes through there. Let's talk a little bit about the comet and how he found it there. Now, Swift habitually went out and scanned the region near the sun at twilight. An hour or so after sunset, about an hour or so before the sun came up in the morning, looking for comets, because evidently it's in that area that he could spot them more easily than any other place. Now, Swift read about, in a New York Times article, he read about a comet that had been found northeast of Polaris. He went out the next night and he looked to see if he could find that comet, and he saw a comet. Now, 3 days later, he read in the New York Times that a second comet had been found by Harvard's Horace Tuttle, but it was not the one that Swift had found, but actually it must have been the one that Swift had found 3 days before, because it was not in the position of the first comet that was reported in the New York Times. Well, there was a certain amount of discussion about who should get credit for something like that. Finally, it was settled that they should both share the discovery on that, even though Tuttle had seen it 3 days later than Swift had. So they finally got co-discovery on that. But that was the big comet that really made his reputation for him begin to take off for him after that. Now, he was noted, of course, for that, having discovered that. And he did become famous, partly because of his knowledge about comets and so on. But as it turned out, many of the scientists at that time habitually called that comet the Tuttle Comet. And unfortunately, a number of years later, he had to admit, so much for fame there, because they had dropped his name off of that. However, of course, now we're back to the point where, yes, it is rightfully called a Swift-Tuttle comet. Now, he seemed to be, through his career, he seemed to be kind of always second class in what was going on. I don't think the scientific community really accepted him as a scientist on that. But on the other hand, they found that he was very accurate as whenever he looked at something and took careful notes on that kind of thing. Now, he was the kind of person that did not particularly join associations or universities or had close ties with universities. Now, in 1833, the Rochester Academy of Science was formed, and they had formed the astronomy section. Now, while Swift did join the Rochester Academy of Science, he never actually joined the astronomy section throughout his career. However, he was known for being open to the public and looking through his scope, allowed them looking through his scope, and he lectured extensively. He wrote weekly articles that appeared in the papers there, entitled Simple Lessons in Astronomy. Later, they'd be bound into a book, and he published the book. He became known then as the first professional astronomer to allow the public to join with him. Now let's think about the Swift-Tuttle comet itself. Back in 1862, it was called 1862 Roman numeral 3. Today, it goes under another name of 109P/Swift-Tuttle. This comet was, perhaps still is, 3 times the size of the Chicxulub asteroid. Now, the modern understanding of its orbit is that it orbits in 133 years. It was last seen in 1992. It will be seen again in 2025. They've calculated there is a 1 in 10,000 chance of it destroying the Earth. So we might keep that in mind for those of you who are going to be around in 2125. Now, the comet is responsible for the midsummer meteor shower, the Perseids. In 1865, Giovanni Schiaparelli realized that the relationship between Swift-Tuttle and the Perseids. Say what?
Awesome. Mary, madam.
Oh, I'm sorry, John. I didn't realize I didn't have it muted. My phone was ringing. Sorry about that.
Okay, that's all right. I thought there were questions, which would be welcome. Now, unfortunately, our local weather broadcasters, they will give you the information that tonight there's going to be the Perseids or something like that. But I have not heard any of them give credit to the fact that it was a local native that discovered that in the first place. I hope maybe that can be changed sometime in the future. Now, his fame was increasing considerably. In 1869, he joined Albany's Dudley Observatory on an expedition to Mattoon, Illinois. And he took his comet seeker on the train along with him. There he was going to study the sun during the total eclipse. Of course, he was interested in prominences and Bailey's beads and those things. Now, in 1872, he sighted another comet, and in the same year, he moved on. In the same year, he moved to Rochester. He had been living around Marathon, as I said, at Hunt's Corners before. Well, 1872, he came to Rochester. Now, when he came to Rochester, he made friends of a local reporter with the newspaper at that time. The newspaper was just simply called The Democrat. They hadn't merged, evidently, with the Chronicle at that time. But he had this friend, Henry C. Means, that published a lot of information about what Swift was doing around Rochester and the sightings that he had had. He wrote on the sightings, and invited the public to come and take a look at at what he was doing out there. So he was conducting star parties in Rochester at that time. In 1874, he had been the first person in the United States to see the Coggia Comet. Easy for some people to say, but not for me. Now, he saw that from Lakeview Park here in Rochester. I'll talk about that in a second. In fact, coming up right now. There were 3 places in Rochester that were of particular interest to him. Here is a present-day map of where that is. This one place, the places that we're interested in is his home, where did he live, and Duffy's cider mill. And off the map up to the top would be Lakeview Park. Now, in 1872, he moved to Rochester with his second wife. His first wife had died in the same year that he discovered the comet, incidentally. More on that a little bit later. His second wife brought along 3 more children, so he had a total of 5 children now. His first wife, Lucretia Hunt, of Hunt's Corners, she had died in 1862. He married again in 64. Caroline Topping was her name, from Long Island, with 3 more children were added there. He opened up a hardware store here in Rochester, and Swift lived on the corner of Ambrose and Saratoga Avenue. And you can see it there on the map, right over here, the little red one right there. I'm not sure which side of that corner he lived on, but he lived on that corner of Ambrose Street down there. Now, the second place, well, we'll talk about this other place. The second place that I would talk about here was on what was called, and I haven't driven up to check to see if it actually exists, Lakeview Park. But I think this is the location of the Nazareth Academy farther on up Lake Avenue, because it was described as a high point, a high elevation point in Rochester. This was on the land of the Congressman Louis Selye, Selye was his name. And people were quite friendly with Louis Swift, and of course he was friendly with them, and they invited him to pursue his interest there. Well, the main one, and that's the one that I think we're most interested in, he was invited to use the roof of the Duffy cider mill, and thanks to Gabriel down at the Rochester Public Library, we determined this is the location of the Duffy cider mill. Eventually it was called the Rochester Distilling Company, and some of you old people might well recognize it on the corner of Judge's Ford. This street of White Street is only about 2 blocks long. It's 1 block away from the corner of Lyle Avenue, and right up there is where it was. Probably a little bit off the center, maybe not quite on the corner itself. But I was also able to find that there is a picture of it. And this is what the original Duffy cider mill would have looked like. Now, in all that I've read, I have not read that anybody used the term tower. And you can see from this illustration, the cider mill did have a tower on it, which of course would have been the highest point around that property that's right there. Now, they do mention that there were difficulties that people had climbing 3 ladders, going across a slanted roof in order to get to a flat roof. And I kind of came to the conclusion a couple of days ago that no, it was not the tower. But I began looking at this again today. And notice, if you will, the top of the tower. Actually, if you look closely up there, that part of the building does not have a slanted roof. It's flat. And if you'll also notice this little thing right here. Now, these are some ventilators, and there are a number of them, various places on the roof up here. But notice this and the ventilator itself, because here we are, a close-up drawing or picture. They said this was made from a picture, but it's obviously a drawing of some kind. This is where he conducted most of his early sightings, up on top of there. And notice what he's leaning on. He's leaning on that rectangular thing right there next to one of these ventilators there on a flat roof over here. So with that in mind, let's find out a little bit about what became here of Swift. First of all, his discoveries led to the moniker of the professor, and people would come to him for information, and he became a real authority on comets themselves. At that time, there was a great deal of talk about canale on the planet Mars, which eventually got kind of I won't use that term. It got changed into canals on Mars. And remember, a number of people at that time also thought that the solar system was populated. Remember, I talked about Dr. Thomas Dick before, and of course, Swift was you might say a student of Dr. Thomas Dick, and he had predicted that the Martians were sending messages to people here on Earth. Well, Swift disagreed with that. He wrote some articles about it in which he kind of debunked the idea that there were any messages being sent from Mars. Then there was a curious thing of baseball. And how do we get Swift tied up with baseball? Baseball was a new sport back then. And there was a pitcher that had perfected something called the curveball. Now, Swift kind of poo-pooed the idea that there could be anything called a curveball. He called it an optical illusion. Well, they had a demonstration, and Swift was there in order to see it. He saw they pitched the ball in an alley someplace, and Swift was looking at the thing, and he was convinced that it actually did curve. That's after he nearly got hit with an optical illusion there. Now, because he admitted the fact that he was wrong in his first opinion, he gained a good deal of credibility with people because of his truthfulness. It was kind of difficult to get a science to recant one of his comments at that time. Well, Swift did. Now, from this location up on the top of Duffy's cider mill, he made history and he made a name for himself. He became an astronomer lecturer. He invited guests to go up on that slanted roof. And between 1877 and 1881, he was credited with having found 6 comets to his own discovery. Now, he won himself 3 gold medals from the Imperial Academy of Science in Vienna, 1 bronze medal from the Royal Astronomy Society, which incidentally was headed by William Herschel at that time. In 1879, he received an honorary PhD from the University of Rochester. He became a fellow of the Astronomical Society, a fellow of the American Association of a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and in 1881 he won the French Lalande Prize, which got him a silver medal and 540 francs. I find this very interesting to tell us a little bit about the conditions under which he did his observing there. Access to this bleak place of observation was only by climbing over several lower roofs and up a rickety wooden ladder, a process hazardous enough to one with sound limbs, but doubly so to him because of his lameness. Now, the tube and stand of the 4.5 inch were left on the roof, but the objective glass and eyepiece were carried back and forth in a basket. And it was by this means that a fall broke the flint glass of the 4.5 inch, talking there about the Comet Seeker. That's what his good friend Edward Emerson Barnard had said. By the way, if you're not familiar with Barnard, he discovered the 5th Jupiter moon, and he's noted for cataloging dark nebula and the discovery or measurement of the Barnard's star. Now, let's think a little bit about what was happening up there on that roof. Take a look at this picture, which supposedly represents what he did there. Now, first of all, the equipment that he used, he wrote or told about. His equipment included 2 blankets, 2 hats, the Comet Seeker, that's what he called his telescope, and his telescope was a homemade telescope about 4 feet long on a pier about 4 feet high. Now, that meant that in order to observe, he had to lie on his back in order to view something. And he did it summer and winter, thus the reason for the blankets and hats that he had there. Now, the original optics in that included a 4.5 inch flint glass objective. I can't tell from what I've read whether it was a single element objective, although in one quote that I have read, it referred, in fact, we just heard it, it referred to the flint glass. It's quite possible that there were 2 elements in there and only one of those glasses got broken, because the other glass might well have been crown glass that he had in order to help with the optical properties of a refractor. Well, anyway, it had a 4.5 inch flint glass, which got broken and was replaced then by Alvan Clark glass, which cost $100 from Clark at that time. Oh, yeah, here it is. All right. $100. Now, $100 at that time would be $2,871 today. And Alvan Clark admitted that this was better. I'm sorry, not Clark. I got a quote from him later on. It was Swift. It was Swift that admitted that this new glass made his telescope even better than the original Fitz glass that he had there. Now, in 1877, he asked a local jeweler, Ernest Grundlock, to design and make a wide-angle eyepiece, which he was able to do by experimentation. He was able to make the eyepiece for him, at least experimentation for the optics in there. This was made up of a 9-element eyepiece with a flat field giving a 3-degree view. Now, I find it interesting, too, to read about what he had to do in order to report the sighting of a comet. First of all, he would recheck his findings. Then he would climb down 3 ladders. He'd catch a horse car into downtown Rochester. He would go to Hiram Sibley's telephone office. He would telegraph the Dudley Observatory in Albany. Then he would telegraph the Vienna Observatory, which was a clearinghouse for comets and observations, and also they gave out medals. And then he would have to wait for confirmation on that. Well, it's not clear exactly how they met, but they established a great relationship, this Herbert Harrington Warner. In 1879, they had a chance meeting at somewhere. Now, H.H. Warner was a businessman selling iron safes. And by the way, his building is still down there on St. Paul, within a block, what would it be, a block north of East Avenue on St. Paul Boulevard on the corner right there. Now, H.H. Harriman was a businessman selling the iron safes, and he made a killing, actually, in patent medicine. He sold Werner's safe liver pills. Now, they seemed to think that liver pills would cure anything back at that time. It turns out that it was the old story of wealth and a name recognition, because Werner, who had a good deal of money, wanted to have a first-rate research and education facility. Now, as he and Swift got together talking about building a nice facility here in Rochester, they kind of took on aperture fever there, because they first thought, well, maybe we should just build have a 7-inch reflector. And it didn't take long for them to step up to the idea of a 16-inch. Swift at that time was beginning to discover a number of nebula, not just comets, and he thought that a 16-inch scope was going to be better for that. Now, let's go on. Thanks, Bill. Bill had sent me this picture, which I picked up a few minutes before we started this. He had found this picture of the Werner's safe cure. Now, look, it's got a picture of an iron safe on it, and it's, of course, a kidney and liver potion there on that kind of thing. From reading about this, I was not sure how to pronounce the information, because it was always listed as Werner's safe liver pills. Now, is it safe if you take it, or does it have something to do with a great big chunk of iron? Anyway, they seem to combine them all together in the trade dress for that. Now, let's talk a little bit about the telescope and Alvin Clark and Sons. Alvin Clark and Sons, located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, succeeded over Henry Fitz as the premier scope maker in the U.S. and maker of the largest refractors in the world. Yerkes Observatory in Wisconsin, north and out of Chicago. Yerkes Observatory has his 40-inch refractor, which is the largest refractor that was ever made. Swift went to Cambridge in order to actually order the telescope. oops, sorry. He went there to order the telescope, and while the telescope was being made, he supervised, or certainly kept an eye on, the construction of both the glass as well as the tube itself. Now, the glass was ordered from Birmingham, England, but after the first batch proved to be defective, they ordered a second one. Swift's scope would become the fourth largest scope in the world, and it outshined the equipment of the other professionals, such as Harvard's Pickering and others. Now, let's look at the details here. Swift's 16-inch telescope was a telescope made with crown and flint elements set 3.5 inches apart. It had a focal length of 22 feet. It had a steel tube, 14 inches at the eyepiece end, 18 inches in the middle and at the objective end, and it had a 3.25-inch finder scope. They claim that it had a power of 2,000, which maybe they did for a refractor at that time. Well, does this look familiar? I certainly hope so. I don't know whether it's an exact replica or not. You can look at it there and see, but I think there's no doubt about it. When the astronomy section of the Rochester Academy of Science was formed in 1932, they took Swift's telescope for its logo on there. Now, Alvin Clark and Son delivered it was Alvin Clark's son that delivered the scope here to Rochester. Now, it sat on a base that was 20 feet wide at the bottom, 9 feet wide at the top. There was an equatorial mount, and it sat on a double pier, because in addition to the base that I just mentioned there before, there was another part of the pier. There was a 9-foot diameter capstone that weighed 8 tons that sat on top of that and held a rectangular mount that brought the whole thing up to floor level in the observatory that was built. Now, it had an automatic RA scale on one side. It had a 28-inch declination circle, which you can see here in the picture very nicely. The objective lens was 24 feet above the floor. And if you look carefully in this picture and other pictures as well, there were ropes hanging from the end of there, and it took 2 people in order to slew the scope to the necessary area. There was an outside elevator that separated itself from the tower itself to avoid any kind of vibrations if anybody were using the elevator there. Now, what was it that Werner did on this in order to build this? H.H. Werner agreed initially to give $20,000 for the building. Now, that's $615,600 today. The city of Rochester was asked to raise another $12,000 or maybe $13,000 for the telescope. Hiram Sibley gave a $1,000 spectroscope for this. Alonzo Watson gave a sidereal clock, and the whole thing came to over $100,000 back then, which really represented over $3 million today. And this is what it looked like. In 1882, Swift had now become a professional astronomer. The facility was completed H. Warner and his family moved into it because now he had a salary for himself. He was living in a splendid house with the first-rate equipment and an astronomical library. Not much is said about that, but he also had that and other things. He was well equipped. He closed his hardware store, and in the next few years, he would discover 2 more comets. The count now came up to 8. Then he turned his attention to cataloging nebula. Sure, he started out finding comets, but he kept stumbling over these nebula. And I think we've heard that story before, haven't we? Well, he found he became an authority on comets at that time, and people came to him for a good deal of information. The Vienna Observatory about that time had stopped giving prizes for comet discoveries. So Werner took up the baton and he started giving out $200 Werner prizes. Now, Swift then was made the judge of whether somebody had discovered a comet and then to award those prizes. It got to be quite a task for him because many people were writing letters claiming to have discovered a comet on there. Now, Swift had very much the same problem as Messier had 100 years earlier. When he was looking for comets, he would run onto these faint, fuzzy things when he was out there. But unlike Messier just basically kept a list of the comets that he had found. He hadn't really put them into a catalog. Swift, on the other hand, started to catalog all of his findings, and then he submitted them to the Herschels, who were making up the NGC catalog, the New General Catalog, and the IC catalog eventually, and Dreyer had worked on those as well. But anyway, he discovered the second biggest. He ended up being the second biggest contributor to those catalogs, the Herschel catalogs, than the Herschels themselves. Now, from this tower, he conducted a good deal of outreach. He invited the public to come up. It was opened up on Tuesdays and Fridays from 8 o'clock until 10 o'clock. There was an elevator outside. You did not have to climb 61 steps to get up to the eyepiece up there. He sold tickets, which you could buy down on St. Paul Street, costing about the same as a movie would today. He gave free lectures. He wrote newspaper articles, and in general, he became known as the people's astronomer. Now, I can't list all of the discoveries that he made, but here is a listing of a number of them there. They carry his name. 13 of them did. He shared discovery of at least 3 other comets that were out there. But look at that. Well over 1,200 uncatalogued nebula and galaxies go to his credit on that. He received an honorary PhD, the Laplace medals, and the Jackson Gilt medal. That medal, by the way, came from England, and the giver of that medal, the widow who gave that medal, wanted that medal to go to, well, we'll have to call it the best astronomer in the world, and he was one of the recipients of that. Now, you got to remember, though, that he was still living in Rochester. And these were some of the things that he had said about that time, about Rochester. Kind of seemed familiar. The climate here was too damp, and the sky was too often cloudy for successful observation. The electric lights of the city also interfered greatly with my view, and I would like to have the observatory placed in Arizona or New Mexico, where I would have the benefit of several degrees more latitude to work, and it would also have 365 cloudless nights out of every year. So that's what Lewis said in 1892. He also said this about the lighting situation. The vast number of electric street lights entirely shrouded the surroundings of the observatory. From a few rods to 3 miles distant, it was so ruinous to the work of the discovery of the observation of nebula that practically it had been abandoned. When the ground is covered with snow and trees denuded from their leaves, the sky illumination almost equals that of a gibbous moon. Well, those were the conditions that he had, and he began to look a little bit to the west to see if maybe there might not be someplace else. In fact, astronomical eyes all over the United States were beginning to turn west, where the 36-inch Clark at Lick Observatory was coming online, you might say. There was talk at that time of a 60-inch telescope for Mount Wilson, and the western clear skies were calling. In 1892, Lewis had only 2 nights in July when he could search the summer skies for nebula. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And he had missed seeing 5 comets at that time. Okay, with all those things going, yeah, he's beginning to look someplace else. And then there was the Third Presbyterian Church. Well, now, just where was this observatory that he had had? We've seen pictures of it as we went along. Well, the Werner Observatory was located at the corner of Arnold Park and East Avenue. Today, if you go down there, it is the open yard of St. John's Lutheran Church across from the Strathallan House. Now, it occupies what now is the open lawn west of the church. Now, it was not clear if these stone gates that you're seeing here in the picture were a part of the parkway. They part of the observatory grounds or just the parkway itself. But anyway, they are still there today. Now, looking east, you can now see the modern church that was there on a nice lawn with trees that obviously were not there. But from 1882 to 1931, this lawn was the location of the Werner Observatory, though it was idle from when it closed in 1892. So it was really open only about 10 years. Now, if you look west, when you look west, you see that the observatory was located and looking on what was new construction of the Third Presbyterian Church. Now, Swift felt that the building and the tower would block much of his western view. But in spite of discussions and negotiations, there was not a change to be made. They would not move to a different location, and they didn't accept any of the offers that Werner had made to them. In fact, even at that time, Werner spoke of locating his observatory someplace else, maybe even out of state. And I don't mean to put it too hard on the Third Presbyterian Church. Obviously, they had come up with their plans on something like that, and they wanted to keep with it.
Sorry.
There were a number of things that
Yeah, I am listening to this. So
there were a number of things that had happened during that period of time that caused them to move from Rochester. And that big
Chamberlain,
thing,
a contractor.
that big thing was the Panic of 1893. Now, let me just fill you in if you're not in tune to old history and stuff like that. The Panic of 1893 affected the whole United States, and many businesses went under. One of the businesses was the Werner business entirely, the safe company, as well as the patent medicine company there. Werner closed up shop and moved off to Minnesota someplace. Now, in 1892, Swift packed up his telescope at night, put it into a boxcar, and took the train west because he had been offered a position out in California. Thaddeus Lowe was an adventurer, and he had been a balloonist during the Civil War, and later he made money by making artificial ice. His dream was a mountaintop resort with a hotel, a zoo, entertainment, horseback riding, and an observatory. Swift and his 16-inch scope and his 4.5-inch comet maker were hired to come out and be the principal person at that observatory. So you can see here you can see here in the picture, this was the resort area down a little bit farther on Echo Mountain, this was called. And up here is where the observatory was in this particular location. So he had hoped that people would come up here for relaxation and vacation, entertainment, and at the same time, they could visit the observatory as well. Now, this observatory was located on Echo Mountain, and the Echo Mountain was located at an elevation of 3,700 feet, just down from another mountain that was above it up there, Mount Wilson, at 5,700 feet. As it turns out, Swift, who was 73 years old, earned the name out there when he was received out there. They received him and called him the Columbus of the sky. Now, this observatory was located 9 degrees south of the Rochester elevation. That meant that he could see the topmost star of the Southern Cross. He could see Canopus. He could see the glob Omega Centauri and many 13 to 15 magnification stars that were within his reach. Now, obviously, things were clearer at that time. That was before the days of Los Angeles smog. But anyway, it was an improvement for him. Now, his youngest son, who incidentally became a very good astronomer himself, his youngest son, Edward, discovered a comet again in 1894. Now, Lowe had the idea of connecting this resort to the public down in the valley, and he put in an electric railroad called the Pacific Electric Railroad, and it remained a tourist attraction from 1892 to 1938. While he was there in that observatory, this is a different picture now, but obviously that's his 16-inch scope that he's got. and the pedestal that was used on there. Before his eyes became too dim and he retired, Swift discovered 3 more comets, a total of 13, and 300 more nebula, and saw for the 3rd time the Leonids, which only are prominent about once every 33 years. And he consulted on the construction of Mount Wilson Observatory. Lewis Swift observed the return of Halley's Comet in 1910 at his home in Marathon, where he had moved, and it was said that he sank to the ground, unable to control his emotions. He died January 5th, 1913, the same day as Thaddeus Lowe. Here are some of the details that you can see that are written here on the screen as to what he had done. Now, the question is then, what happened to Swift's 16-inch Alvan Clark telescope? Well, there were a number of California wildfires, as we know, a severe one in 1900, another in 1905. The wildfires took out the hotel and the resort early in the 20th century, and it damaged some of Swift's articles and his papers, but the scope and the optics were saved. Now, other than for a project by William Pickering in the early part, what are we doing here? Here we are. All right. Now, other than being used by William Pickering before 1928, the scope was primarily used for public observing. Then a great wind came and damaged the whole Lowe Observatory, and the scope had to be repaired, which it was repaired, and it was put in storage by the Pacific Railway Company until eventually it was sold to Santa Clara University. After 1944, the scope was used for astronomy classes, but due to a decline in the astronomy program, it fell into disuse. It was housed in the Father Ricard Memorial Observatory, and it was used for classroom use. Now, what about the scope today? Well, in 1991, a group of students got permission to refurbish the 110-year-old scope, and it was put back into use for undergraduate observational astronomy and for outreach. When asbestos removal and seismic retrofit was needed to the Ricard Memorial Observatory in 2008, the dome area was emptied, and then it was refilled with administrative offices and an archaeology work area. I cannot find where the scope is today. I have called Santa Clara University for 2 weeks now. I have left probably 10 voicemails asking somebody to call me back. I've called the director of facilities. I've called the archaeology department. I've called the memorial itself. Nobody will pick up the phone, in spite of the fact it gives me a voicemail on there. I would just simply like to know, where's the scope now? Because obviously it's not being used, and it's a Alvan Clark 16-inch telescope that certainly has some kind of value. Well, what is the legacy here of Lewis Swift? Swift, this is said by his good friend E. Barnard. Swift was a genial and happy disposition. He was generous to the struggling amateur and was always liberal with help and with advice to those who were striving to gain a foothold in the sciences of astronomy. Great praise from his good friend. Now, there are many outstanding names in the history of astronomy, but Lewis Swift, I guess, could be considered the people's astronomer. Considering Rochester's ongoing interest in science and optics and astronomy, Swift played no small part of it. Swift, well, these are his accomplishments, some of them in there. As I said before, you really can't list all of them on any kind of a slideshow like this. His name may not be a textbook example, but his labored accomplishments demand recognition, and especially from a local kid like our Lewis Swift. How about an epilogue on something like this? What about this? First of all, we have a remote member of ASRAS, David Hasenauer. He lives in Southern California, not far away from Echo Mountain and Mount Wilson. He has a project going on that he's working on right now called the Swift Observing Program. Now, this is similar to the programs related to the Herschel 400 or the Messier Marathon. It's a program for as an observing challenge for visual observers with a reasonably large aperture telescopes, such as bigger than 12 inches, or for people who are doing astroimaging. Now, he's compiling a candidate list of objects that can be, when it's finalized, he hopes to submit it to the Astronomical League to be included as one of their official observing programs. Now, Dave is looking for observers to help him look through this list and see, pardon me, see what's possible for people to actually see. If you'd like to help out, give him an email, and he'll get back in contact with you.
So, can you just pause for 1 second, Don? So, David Hasenauer is online. David, did you want to make some comments?
Go ahead, Dave.
Thank you, Don. I think you covered it very well. So, this is a work in progress. I've got a candidate list of about 220 of the brighter Swift discoveries, both from the NGC and IC catalogs. And I'm in the process right now trying to observe all 220. Now, some are probably a little bit more easily visible from the southern latitude that I live at, but the feeling is that what I like to do with this program is to have a candidate list, and then observers can choose any 100 objects. And there's plenty of objects both south of plus 30 declination and north of minus 30 declination. So it should allow this to be observed, in both hemispheres. But I am looking if folks are interested in helping out in trying to observe these, and I'm mostly looking for a ranking of hard, easy, moderate, difficult, or very difficult. And I actually have kind of a definition, a key for that. But yeah, send me an email if you're interested, and I'll send you a lot more detail. Thanks very much. And I apologize that I did not realize when I joined in the middle of the talk that I was not muted. So I hope I wasn't disruptive there. Sorry about that.
That's okay. No problem. Thank you, Dave, for clarifying that and giving us that information. Incidentally, the next slide that I'm going to show after I talk about this epilogue here is actually a bibliography of some of the easily found references if you want to go back and study more about Lewis Swift. what I suggest is get yourself ready, and when the next slide comes up, just make yourself a screenshot of it, and you'll have the bibliography. We can send that out later by email to everybody, but just to give you a heads up on that type of thing. The next question that I have in the epilogue is the Comet Seeker. Where is it? Now, this gets to be very, very curious here, because in his article, So Much for Fame, Peter Wlask, maybe, refers to an article in a 1940 The Sky, before it became Sky and Telescope, 1940 Sky. He refers to an article and a conversation with Ken Brown of the astronomy section of Rochester Academy of Science. And Ken Brown said that an ASRAS member may have had and may have sold at least the optics to the Comet Seeker. Very interesting. Anybody know anything about that? Well, consider that, and maybe we can talk about it at another time at meetings or something like that. Then, finally, let's just simply finish up here with the third point in the epilogue, and that is the Swift Tuttle. It was last seen in autumn of 1992. It had a magnification of +5, 2-degree tail, and it will return in 2126, 26 or 25. Then it has a 1 to 1,000, 1 to 10,000 chance of hitting the Earth. So who knows? Maybe we'll know something about that. They've recalculated that, and they don't seem to think that there's really a chance it's going to hit the Earth, but it is going to come close in 21, 25, or 26. Now, as we finish up here, here is the bibliography that I was talking to you about, and I urge you to take a look at these. Most all of this stuff is all online. You can look it up very easily. I definitely used and enjoyed the works there. So Much for Fame, an article that is actually publicized by NASA now. But I would urge you to take a look at that one, because it's very good. In addition to that, I also am intrigued with, going the wrong way. I'm also intrigued with the very last reference that we have down here that I will take advantage of the next time I drive to Florida, and that is there is a YouTube tour of the South Carolina State Museum telescope exhibit. If you get to Columbia, South Carolina, you might want to stop in at that museum. From the YouTube, I think you'll get excited too. They have lots and lots of, it looks like refractor telescopes, but they also have some kind of an exhibit to talk about telescope making and grinding of the glass and that kind of thing. So if you're in the neighborhood sometime, you might want to check that out. So with that, everybody, thank you for holding on. I've given you just a part of the information about Lewis Swift, because there's an awful lot that I have left out. I appreciate your patience, and if you have any questions, let's talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Questions for Don? Comments?
I think James got a question in the chat.
Okay. The one about the astronomical city? Not sure I'm seeing the bottom of the chat.
Yeah, he asked why it was known as astronomical city.
Well, it goes along with the comments that I had made about the 1870s and 1880s. There was a great deal of interest in manufacturing, in science, and at that time there was a good deal of interest in astronomy as well, and it just came to be called among perhaps local people. I don't know how much worldwide or nationwide fame there might have been, but they began referring to Rochester as the astronomical city.
Frank Bogus. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Don.
No,
Sorry.
just thanks, Nick. Appreciate your comment, your question.
Frank had a comment. I think it's Frank Bo. That he thought he's seen Swift's telescope. Frank, did you want to share any more on that?
Yeah. Let's see, am I unmuted? Yeah. Okay, I'm unmuted. It was at the Boulder, Colorado planetarium, and it was stuck against a wall in a room without enough roof for it to be anything more than a T. A tube on a pier. And I went up and looked at it. And I don't know if it had the lenses and stuff in it, but it said it was Swift's telescope.
Now,
Okay.
Frank, are you talking about Swift's 16-inch?
Oh yeah, it's the big one. It's the one that's on our logo. That's exactly what it looked like.
Huh.
Well,
Boulder.
that's interesting. As I say, I still haven't been able to get Santa Clara University to answer the question as to where it's at now. But as of 2008, it was still in their possession out there when they when they did some remodeling.
And I'm trying to think when it was. I go to Boulder on occasion because a very old friend lives there.
Yeah.
I used to travel for work a lot and got to go there on like anytime I was in Denver, I'd take the weekend, go up to Boulder. And I know we were there in 92 and 93 because we drove. But I don't remember the last time I was there or the time specifically when I would have gone to the planetarium in Boulder.
Yeah.
It's on University of Colorado.
Yeah.
It was on the campus. May not even be there. I mean, this could have been 20, well, probably was more than 15. It could have been 20, 25 years ago, but I know it was after I was interested in the club because I recognized the thing and didn't think much of it at the time.
Yeah, that's interesting. There, of course, were many Alvin Clark telescopes of various sizes that were made. 2 years ago, I think it was, I was in the Adler Planetarium and I saw and I photographed a good-sized telescope that was there. And in my research, I ran onto the fact that it was an 18-inch telescope that was used. Oh, golly, where was it used? Oh, it was called the Dearborn telescope at that time. Then what they did was took the optics out of it and sent those optics north to Evanston, where it, as far as I know, it's at least being housed, if not actually being used, but it's being used by Northwestern University. And now that they have in Chicago is basically the tube with no glass in it there. But that was the original tube of the 18-inch that ended up in up there in Evanston on there. But yeah, if you're interested, I was really surprised to see that display down there in South Carolina. A fellow in South Carolina had a lot of money and collected an awful lot of Alvin Clark telescopes and perhaps telescopes by other people as well. But there certainly were a number of Alvin Clark telescopes. By the way, there is one here in Rochester, and that is up, where is it? Up on the third floor of of the Rochester Museum and Science Center. You go up there, it's up there where you can see it. It might be nice if they knocked off some of the dust on the thing, but it's up there as well. So if you have an interest, you might follow that up. Any other questions? Thank you, Frank. Appreciate that. Yeah. Well, folks, thank you very much, Carol, and I think that we can probably sign off now.
Sure. Thanks, Don. This was awesome. I'm going to stop the recording. Let's see, because that's probably enough. Where is that button? Oh, maybe I just go.